I was washing dishes when I heard tires crunch across the gravel driveway. That sound used to mean nothing. Now it made my stomach drop. I turned off the faucet and stood there with wet hands listening. A car door opened, then another. Footsteps on the porch, and then the knock. 3 times, slow and deliberate, like whoever was on the other side had practiced it. I already knew who it was. I just didn't know what I was going to do about it. Let me back up. Because to understand that moment, you have to understand the 11 years that came before it. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 32 years teaching high school history in Denton, Texas, and I retired at 61 with a pension, a bad knee, and a house that suddenly felt very large and very quiet. My wife, Carol, had passed 4 years before that, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I rattled around in our house on Clover Mill Road like a marble in a shoebox. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays. I watched too much baseball. I called my daughter Vivian every Sunday evening, and she always picked up, but she never really talked. Just fine and busy, and I'll call you back, and she never did. Vivian was 34 at the time. She lived in Austin with her husband, a man named Curtis who sold commercial real estate and wore his watch too tight and always seemed vaguely annoyed by everything. They'd gotten married fast, 6 months after they met, and I had stood at that altar trying to look happy for her. Carol would have seen through Curtis in about 8 minutes. I gave it longer because I wanted to be wrong. I wasn't wrong. Vivian got pregnant the 2nd year of their marriage. She called me on a Thursday night in February to tell me, and I could hear something in her voice, not joy exactly, more like relief mixed with fear. I asked if she was happy. She said, "I think so, Daddy." I wrote it down in the small notebook I kept by the phone back then, the one Carol gave me. I don't know why I wrote it down. Something told me to. My grandson was born in October. They named him Miles. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. I drove down to Austin the weekend after and sat in the hospital room holding him while Vivian slept and Curtis took calls in the hallway. Miles had Carol's ears, slightly pointed at the top, and I told him so while he stared at me with those dark, unfocused, newborn eyes. I stayed 5 days. Vivian seemed grateful. Curtis seemed ready for me to leave. I drove back to Denton and waited for them to call. They didn't call often. The first year was hard to read from a distance. Vivian would send photos. Miles in a onesie, Miles in a swing, Miles at the park, and I would enlarge them on my phone and look for signs of something, though I couldn't have told you what. He was a quiet baby. I knew that much. Vivian mentioned it casually once, that he didn't cry the way she expected, that he seemed to be somewhere else even when he was in the room. She said it like it was charming. I stored it away. By the time Miles was 2, the photos came less often. By 2.5, Vivian stopped sending them altogether. I called one Sunday evening, and Curtis answered instead. He said Vivian was going through some things. I asked what things. He said, "You know how she gets." I didn't actually, but I didn't push. What I pieced together over the next several months, from a cousin of Vivian's who still talked to me, from a mutual friend in Austin, was this. Miles had started showing signs that worried his pediatrician. He wasn't meeting speech milestones. He lined up his toys in precise rows and became inconsolable if they were moved. He'd started covering his ears in grocery stores and restaurants, sometimes sitting down on the floor and refusing to move until the noise stopped. The pediatrician had referred them to a developmental specialist. That appointment had been rescheduled twice. Vivian called me on a Sunday in March, when Miles was almost 3. She called in the afternoon, which she never did, and I knew before I picked up that something was different. "We need to talk about Miles," she said. She told me the specialist had given them a preliminary diagnosis, autism spectrum disorder. She said the words carefully, like she was reading from a card. I asked her how she was feeling. There was a long pause. "Daddy," she said, "I don't think I can do this." I told her lots of families navigate this. I told her Miles was still Miles, I told her I'd come down that weekend if she wanted. She said she'd think about it. She never called back about that weekend. 2 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window. Vivian got out. She looked thin. She was wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast. She walked around to the back seat and unbuckled Miles from his car seat. He was wearing his red sneakers, the ones with the Velcro straps, because he hadn't learned to tie laces yet. She carried him up my porch steps, knocked twice, and when I opened the door, she said, "I need you to take him for a while." She had a backpack for him, 2 changes of clothes, his stuffed elephant, a container of goldfish crackers, and a spiral notebook where she'd written down his schedule in looping, hurried handwriting. I looked at her face, trying to find something I could hold on to. "How long is a while?" I asked. She kissed Miles on the top of his head and set him down. He immediately walked past me into the house. He stood in the living room and looked at the bookshelves for a moment, then began touching the spines one at a time, left to right. Vivian was already halfway down the porch steps. "I'll call you," she said. She didn't call. Not that week, not the next. Curtis texted me once, 6 weeks later. "Let us know how he's doing," like I was a kennel they'd boarded a dog with. I didn't respond to Curtis. What I did instead was figure out how to be a father again, at 62 years old, to a 3-year-old boy who didn't speak more than 12 words and who needed the volume on the television kept at exactly 14 and who ate scrambled eggs every morning, but only if they were slightly crispy on the edges, never soft, and whose meltdowns could last 40 minutes and leave us both exhausted on the kitchen floor. I learned. Lord, I learned. I found a developmental pediatrician in Denton who had a 3-month wait list, and I took the first cancellation they had. Her name was Dr. Porch Figueroa, and she was the kind of person who crouched down to Miles's level every single time and waited, really waited, for him to respond on his own terms. After his evaluation, she sat across from me in her office and told me Miles had level 2 autism, that he would need significant support, that early intervention was critical, and that with the right services, he could make remarkable progress. "What does remarkable look like?" I asked. She smiled in a way that was honest rather than reassuring. "Different for every child," she said. "But Miles has something. I've been doing this 18 years. I can see it." I enrolled him in speech therapy twice a week. I drove him 40 minutes each way because the practice in Denton had a 6-month wait and the one in Louisville had a slot open in 3 weeks. His therapist was a young woman named, well, she'd prefer I not use her name here, but she had a gift for finding the edge of where Miles was comfortable and nudging him, never pushing. Always nudging him. Within 4 months, he had added 30 words. Within 8 months, he was using 2-word phrases consistently. I called Vivian to tell her. Her number had been disconnected. I spent a week trying to track down a working number. Eventually, her cousin gave me a new one. I texted first, told her Miles was doing well, that he was in speech therapy, that I wanted her to know. She read it. I could see the read receipt, and didn't respond. That was when I understood that a while had no end date. I went to a family law attorney in Denton and asked about guardianship. He was a quiet man who listened without interrupting and then explained to me that informal caregiving arrangements like mine were legally fragile, that unless I had formal guardianship, I had no legal authority to make medical decisions, enroll him in school, or protect him if anyone came to claim him. I filed for emergency guardianship that same month. The process took 4 months. Vivian did not contest it. Curtis didn't even respond to the notification. The judge granted me full legal guardianship on a Thursday afternoon in October, the same month Miles turned 4. I drove him to get ice cream afterward. He got vanilla, which he ate methodically, 1 small spoonful at a time, rotating the cup 90 degrees between each bite. "Good?" I asked. He looked at me very seriously and said, "Cold, good cold." I nearly lost it right there in the parking lot of that Dairy Queen. The school years were their own kind of war. I walked into Miles's kindergarten intake meeting expecting to work with the school district and found instead a table full of people who had already decided what Miles could and couldn't do before they'd met him. They wanted to place him in a self-contained classroom with no general education contact. I had done my reading by then. I knew what IDA required. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which mandates that every child with a disability receive education in the least restrictive environment possible. I told them I understood their concerns. I told them I also understood federal law. I requested a full IEP meeting. The assistant superintendent called me difficult. Miles spent kindergarten in a blended classroom with a one-on-one aide. By the end of first grade, he was reading at a third grade level. What none of his teachers fully understood, what took me years to fully understand, was how Miles's mind actually worked. He was delayed across the board. He was extremely advanced in certain ways and significantly challenged in others. He could look at a map once and reconstruct it from memory. He could hear a piece of music and identify the time signature immediately. And starting around age 8, when I let him use my old laptop to play some basic educational games, he became obsessed with how the games were built. He started asking questions I couldn't answer. How does the computer know what I clicked? Where does the picture come from? Why does this load faster than that? I found him a used book on basic Python programming at a garage sale. He finished it in 9 days. I got him another one. He finished that in 5. I contacted a professor at UNT, the University of North Texas, about 20 minutes from our house, and explained my situation. I told him I had an 11-year-old who'd burned through every introductory programming book I could find, and I didn't know what to do next. That professor, a generous man I will owe something to for the rest of my life, agreed to meet Miles. He spent 2 hours with him in his office. Afterward, he told me Miles had an intuitive understanding of systems logic that he rarely saw in his undergraduates. He arranged for Miles to sit in on 2 courses per semester, informally, as an observer, not for credit, just to be in the room. Miles was 12. He sat in those classes with his notebook and his mechanical pencil, and he never made a sound, but he filled those notebooks top to bottom, both sides of every page. At home, he built things. Small at first, little programs that sorted data, calculated routes, generated patterns, then larger. He'd identified a gap, he told me one night while I was washing dishes. A lot of applications for people with communication differences assumed the user would adapt to the interface. Miles thought it should be the other way around. The interface should figure out the person, he said. He was 13 when he started building it, 14 when he showed me the first working version, an adaptive communication platform that used pattern recognition to learn individual users' communication styles and adjust accordingly. Simplified, it was an app that got better at understanding you the more you used it. Designed specifically for people with autism, nonverbal communication needs, and language processing differences. I am not a technology person. I taught high school history for 32 years, but I watched that thing work, and I understood what I was seeing. Miles spent 18 months refining it. He found a mentor through a tech incubator in Dallas, a woman who'd built and sold 2 apps and who took one look at Miles's prototype and told him, bluntly, that he had something real. She helped him navigate the process I could not have helped him navigate alone. They applied for a small business grant through a state program. They brought in a part-time developer to help clean the code. They filed for a provisional patent. Miles was 16 when they launched it. By the time he was 17, the platform had been acquired by a healthcare technology firm based in Nashville for $3.2 million, plus an equity stake that analysts valued at approximately another $1.4 million. Miles received financial and legal guidance throughout the process. Every document had his name on it and mine. I want to be clear about something. Miles understood every step of what was happening. Some people hear autistic teenager and picture someone who needs to be managed and protected from complexity. Miles read the acquisition term sheet himself. He asked questions his attorney said were unusually precise. He knew what he was signing and what it meant. He was 17 years old and he had built something that changed people's lives, and he had sold it for $4.6 million. I took him to his favorite barbecue place in Denton afterward. He ordered the brisket plate, no sauce, pickles on the side. He ate with the focused quiet he'd had since he was 3 years old. When he was about halfway through his plate, he looked up at me and said, "Grandpa, I want to set up a college fund for kids who can't afford their IEPs." I put down my fork. "Okay," I said. "We can call it something simple," he said. "Not after me." "Whatever you want," I said. He nodded and went back to his brisket. I sat there across from this boy I had raised from the age of 3, and I thought about Carol, who never got to meet him, and about Vivienne, who had driven away 14 years ago in a car I didn't recognize, and about that notebook by the phone where I'd written, "I think so." Daddy, in February a lifetime ago, I thought about the IEP meetings and the 2-hour drives and the 40-minute meltdowns and the nights I sat outside Miles's bedroom door on the hallway floor because he was upset and needed to know I was close but not too close. I thought about all of it. Then I paid the check and we drove home. The knock on the door came 6 weeks later. I had suspected it might. After the acquisition closed, there was some press coverage, not a lot, but enough. A piece in a Dallas Tech newsletter, a short segment on a local news affiliate. Miles's name was in it. So was mine. So inevitably was the dollar figure. I opened the door. Vivienne was standing on my porch. She looked different than I remembered. Older, which was obvious, 14 years having passed, but also somehow softer, like something had worn her down. She was wearing a blazer. Her hair was shorter. She had her purse on her arm, and a man I had never seen before standing slightly behind her and to the left. He was in his 40s, gray at the temples, carrying a leather portfolio. Not Curtis. Curtis had apparently been out of the picture for years. The man introduced himself. He was an attorney, family law. I stood in my doorway for a moment. Just one moment. "Miles is in the house," I said quietly. Not to them, to myself, really. The attorney explained that Vivienne was seeking to establish or re-establish, as he put it, her parental relationship with Miles. He used a lot of careful language. He talked about biological connection. He talked about Miles's recent change in financial circumstances. He talked about the importance of family. I looked at Vivienne the whole time he taught. She didn't quite meet my eyes. When the attorney finished, I said, "Would you give us a moment?" He nodded and stepped back toward the car. Vivienne and I stood there on the porch. I'd replayed this moment in my head many times over the years. What I'd say, how I'd feel, whether I'd be angry or sad or cold or some combination of all three. I mostly just felt tired. "He's doing well," I said. "I know," she said. "I've seen some of it." "Have you?" She had the grace to look down. "Daddy, I was in a bad place." "I know you were," I said. I said it evenly, not harshly. "I've known that for a long time. I want to know him. That," I said, "is not up to me." I stepped back inside and closed the screen door between us and called into the house. "Miles, there's someone here who wants to speak with you. You don't have to come out if you don't want to." Silence for a moment, then footsteps on the stairs. Miles appeared at my shoulder. 17 years old, nearly 6 feet, with Carol's ears and his own particular stillness. He looked through the screen at Vivienne. He took her in the way he took in everything, carefully, without rushing, processing. Vivienne made a small sound. Her hand went to her mouth. Miles looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in the same level voice he used for everything, "You're my mother." It wasn't a question. Yes, Vivian said. Her voice broke on the word. Miles was quiet for another moment. Then he turned to me. Did she bring a lawyer? She did, I said. He nodded slowly. Okay. He looked back at Vivian through the screen. I'll talk to you. But I want Grandpa there, and I want the lawyer to wait in the car. Vivian looked startled. The attorney, still near the car, seemed uncertain. That's a reasonable request, Miles said, as if clarifying something. They came inside. The attorney waited in the car. The three of us sat in the living room, me in the armchair I'd had since Carol picked it out, Vivian on one end of the couch, Miles on the other. Miles had a glass of water. He didn't offer Vivian anything, not out of hostility, I think, but because hospitality wasn't something he thought of when he was in an unfamiliar situation. He was allocating all his processing to the conversation. Vivian talked for a long time. She talked about her marriage falling apart, about the depression she hadn't named until she was 39, about the years she'd lost to it. She talked about the shame that made it hard to reach out, the way each passing year made it harder rather than easier. She talked about seeing the new story and feeling proud and sad at the same time. Miles listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. When she finished, he said, "Can I ask you some questions?" "Yes," she said. "When did you know you were going to leave me here?" She flinched. It wasn't exactly planned. The bag was packed, Miles said. Not accusing, just noting. Vivian closed her eyes. "I had packed it the night before," she said. "Okay," Miles said. "Why now? The new story?" "Miles, I'm asking because it matters to me," he said. "I want to understand the sequence." Vivian looked at me. I gave her nothing. "Both," she said finally. "The story, and I've been thinking about it for years, but the story made it urgent. Made me findable," Miles said. She didn't answer. Miles set his water glass down on the coaster. He always used the coaster, and folded his hands in his lap. "I don't hate you," he said. "I want you to know that, because I think you came here expecting me to. I don't understand what you did. I don't understand what you did. I don't think I'll ever fully understand it, but I'm not angry." Vivian was crying quietly. She hadn't reached for a tissue because I don't think she'd planned on crying. "What I want to be clear about," Miles continued, "is that the money is mine. My attorney has already advised me on protective measures, and those are in place. If you came here because of the acquisition, I want you to know that it changes nothing about how my finances are structured. Grandpa helped me understand that part early. I had, in fact, hired a financial attorney before the acquisition closed, specifically because I anticipated something like this. Miles had been part of every conversation. He knew the landscape." Vivian shook her head. "I don't want your money, Miles." Miles looked at her steadily. "Okay," he said. "I believe you might mean that right now." The room was quiet for a moment. "Can I come back?" Vivian asked. "Not to demand anything. Just." "Not to demand anything. Just. Can I come back sometime?" Miles thought about this in his particular way, which involved going completely still and looking at a middle distance for several seconds. "You can come back," he said. "I won't promise it'll be easy. I don't have a relationship with you. I don't have a relationship with you. I don't know you. That's the truth. If you want to be known, it takes time." He paused. "I have time. I don't know if you do." She nodded. "I'll make time, then." "Yes," Miles said. "You can come back." He stood up. Not rudely, he simply stood because the conversation was, to his mind, complete. He picked up his water glass and took it to the kitchen sink and rinsed it and put it in the dish rack. Vivian and I sat there another moment. "He's extraordinary," she said softly. "I know," I said. "You did that." "No," I said. I was quiet for a moment. "He did that." "No," I said. I was quiet for a moment. "He did that." I just made sure nobody got in his way. She left. The attorney's car pulled out of the driveway behind hers. I stood at the door and watched the dust settle. Miles came back into the living room and sat down where he'd been sitting and picked up the book he'd been reading before all of this happened. Something about distributed computing systems. He found his page, straightened the spine carefully, and began reading. I went back to the kitchen and finished washing the dishes. After a while, Miles called from the living room. "Is she going to come back?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe. That's fine," he said. "Either way is fine." I stood there at the sink with wet hands. "You handled that well," I said. A pause. "Pages turning. You taught me how," he said. "I don't have a big tidy ending to put on this. Life doesn't work that way, and I've been around too long to pretend it does. Vivian has called twice since that afternoon. The conversations are short and careful, like people crossing a frozen lake, testing each step before putting their weight down. I don't know what they'll become. Miles seems open to the possibility of something, which is more than anyone had a right to expect. What I know is this: 32 years in the classroom taught me that every person has a way of understanding the world that belongs only to them. The job, whether you're a teacher or a grandfather or just someone who showed up when it mattered, is not to change that understanding. It's to protect the conditions that let it grow. Miles built something that helps people communicate when words fail them. I like to think Kara would have found that fitting. She always said the most important conversations were the ones we almost didn't have. I still have that notebook by the phone. I don't write in it anymore, but I keep it there, next to the dish rack, next to the window that looks out over Clover Mill Road, just in case I need to remember where all of this started.